In this part of the tutorial, let's discuss my process for creating bespoke geometry, my way of thinking. Let's look at the geometry that I've modeled over the past few projects that I've done, and why I went about it the way I did, and what was my logic and my reasoning behind my decisions. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit here and look at what we've got here. So, I've modeled a lot of props. I've modeled some small temples, things like that, balconies, some construction as well, including ladders, just, I guess, a lot of wooden objects, some piers that I use for making little ports, some small buildings that are just basically squares with some extruded edges, and here I've got some arches and some towers, as well as some large temples, just giving me a nice variety of things. So I tend to not go into too much detail with any of these when modeling. For example, here I've got some trees. If we look at one of these props, you can see that they're all extremely simply modeled. There's very little detail or effort put into them. Really, any beginner modeler could do any of this, and that applies to everything here. I've been reusing these objects in quite a few projects recently, especially in this one that I'm constructing this tutorial about. So why do I not model these with more detail? Well, not only have I not modeled them in a very detailed manner, these are actually very messy models and very simple. None of this is clean geometry, and I'm not a master modeler, but nor do I have to be, really, in this case. For a project like this, at least. So, not only are these not detailed, they're also not UV'd, and I don't do any bespoke textures for any of these. So they're as simple as they can get. So my technique is to just put in as much detail as is going to be visible on the screen. So like, if we look at this building, we can see that it has a little bit of detail, but all of these little details are not going to be more than a pixel on the screen, so there is no point in making them any more detailed. So this either depends on the scale of the object. For example, here, if we look at the small objects, I've barely put any detail into them, they're just cubes and things like that. Or if, on the other hand, the objects are far away, then I tend to put less detail in. If something is closer to the camera, I'll do a bit more work, but if we look at this object, it is incredibly simple. Here I've brought in an image, in fact the final version of my painting, and I'm just going to use it to show you why I don't tend to go into too much detail with my modeling. So if I zoom in here, and we look at, say, any of these temples, maybe this one. It is not at all very detailed. It's only about as detailed as they need to be given their distance from the camera. So if I feel like they need some detailing, I put some on, but here I see no point in making any of these too detailed because most of that detail gets lost, and we also paint some in later on in the matte painting process, and there's just no reason to waste all of my time putting all of that effort into the modeling. And so this is a project that I've created by myself in a short span of time with no team to help me, and so I have to find all of these tricks and ways to get around spending a lot of time on the project. If I had a team, then maybe we could together model all of these perfectly and really put all the care and effort into these that each building needs, but by myself there's no point. So if we look at this tower, this is the same one as in the image. It has some details, as you can see, but this is only slightly detailed and doesn't take very long to make. And as we can see in the image, there's no point in actually adding any more detail because it looks perfectly detailed at the distance that it is at. So my main goal when working is efficiency, both in the modeling and in the texturing, and later on in the painting. So for the textures as well, as I said, we haven't made any UVs, and we will be using triplanar textures and painting techniques to actually fill the painting with color later on. For example, here we can add tiny bits of detail to the edges of these objects in order to make them look slightly more detailed and to soften up the edges and really just provide that detail where we need it, when we need it in the image, once we can see the whole image, instead of modeling all of this at the start and spending all of this effort on individual buildings, and this effort might be wasted later on if the object is not seen. So in addition, another thing to consider is reusability. So these buildings are as simple as they can get, and I've been using them for a few projects now. And my whole point when modeling them and all of this other geometry was to make sure that it was versatile enough to be used in many different situations, and it can be just slightly disguised, for example here in this part of the image, and they look like anything. I can overpaint slight bits of detail on them and get a lot of varied results. So I get away with this lack of detail in the modeling stage because I'm able to then just use the amount of them that I have, which is in this image thousands, along with painted over detail, to actually make them look good. If you have an entire team of people behind you helping you, then yes, of course, you can make things more detailed. Maybe you have an asset that appears in several shots, or you have an entire sequence of shots on maybe a movie that you're working on, where these assets will appear from all angles, all directions, multiple times. Then in that case, yeah, it would be worth modeling everything nicely and texturing and making sure that you can reuse this asset. But for one-off shots and carefully planned out situations, this is a great technique because you can get more with less. I'll now discuss all of my modeling techniques. If you think this is too basic for you, feel free to skip ahead in this tutorial. Okay, so let's have a quick look at modeling some new geometry. So let's just select everything and click Ctrl H to hide. And let's go back to the origin. And I usually tend to start off with a very simple shape. Let's go with a cube. So basically I will want to model the cube base of this building. I will want to model this little roof with the consideration that my image may not be seeing this detail underneath the roof. But then again, I try to think of projects in the future which may be pointed up from a similar angle to this image, so I'll just model these in as well, just to have slightly more detail. It's not that much work. Then above I will create this top bit, these little towers, as well as the dome with all of the decorations on top as well. And again, I'm not going to spend much time on this, so feel free to watch this or feel free to skip. I will go through the general basic approach in Maya that I use for modeling and the basic tools. So let's just start off by making this bigger. Okay, let's raise this up slightly to the origin, or to the XZ plane rather. So a cool thing you can do is, for example, if your bottom isn't matching up with the grid, what you can do is right click to select vertices, select them all, and I think here, yeah, we can find absolute transform, and in the Y just click 0. And all of these vertices will be put on 0 on the XZ plane. So let's select the top plane, and we'll drag this down to here, and this will be the base of our building. I think, yeah, about that much. For the sake of making this slightly better, let's add this little ledge that is seen here. I will do this by going to Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop, and if we double click on the icon on the left, we can go into the edge loop settings, and let's just select relative distance from edge, and let's just drop these in somewhere around here, and another one. And now if I go to faces and select one and double click on the adjacent one while having shift selected, it will select the entire loop. So now that I have this selected, I can click to extrude here, and I'll just extrude it inwards slightly. And that's a nice little bit of detail, in case this ever ends up being a little bit closer to the camera than we expected. So, yeah, let me actually extend the top a little bit more. You know, we can use the cube for that entire part of the building. So let's just put it up there. And let's just extrude again. And let's click R to scale. And we'll make it slightly larger like so. And then if you click G, it reselects your previous tool. So we are extruding again. And now click G again to extrude up. And let's extrude like this. And extrude up again. Okay, about that much. And let's click G to extrude again. Outwards, extrude, up. Just a lot of repetition of this. Extrude again and scale down. And extrude one last time and push in. Just to create a balcony or a rooftop. Okay? So that's the basic shape of our building. Very simple and straightforward. Next thing I'm going to do is I'll create this base for the dome, and it looks like maybe an octagon? Could be a hexagon. I'll go with octagon. So let's just create a cylinder. Let's move it up, and let's go into its settings here. And let's change the subdivision axis. Okay, 8, octagon. Might be a hexagon, but it's not necessary for this to be perfect. That should be good enough. And let's scale it up. Okay. The corners don't seem to be matching up. Let me rotate this slightly. What angle would it be? 22.5? Okay, so that's half of 45 degrees, which is, again, half of 90. So if a square has 4 angles at 90 degrees, then an octagon surely has 8 at 22.5. I think. Okay, so that's now straight towards the edge. So let's move this down a bit. Scale it down, sorry. Okay, about that much. And now we're making the base of the dome. So let's do some simple... Okay, let's select all of these top faces and select everything from the side. And then if we control click and deselect all of these, we only have the top faces selected, which is a neat trick. Again, I'm just trying to find the quickest ways of doing things. So let's extrude. And let's just extrude outwards a little bit, just trying to match that edge in the photo. And move it up and extrude it. And these little edges are maybe the most important parts when you're modeling at this low resolution, because the edges are quite noticeable at a distance because they catch a little bit of light. So if you can give them a little bit of variety so that they're not just straight, there's things jutting in and out, it adds a lot when creating cities, I feel. So I'll just do this. And this. And let's go in. So we just keep extruding like so. Something like that. I'm not aiming to be perfect here, just trying to get the general shape. If you double click on an edge, you can select an entire loop and then move it. So now we have that part. Let's make it a little bit bigger. When scaling, for example, if you scale just by clicking that cube, it'll scale up. However, if you hold down Control and scale, it'll scale in every axis other than the axis selected. So let's just scale it up slightly like so. Yeah, kind of similar. Alright, cool. Now let's create the dome itself. So let's create a sphere and bring it up and enlarge it. Alright. That looks about the correct size. I'm not going to bother counting those grooves, but let's say there are maybe 30? Something like that. Now I think we can bring this up. And let's select all of these faces at the bottom. Let's just make sure we haven't selected any more. And let's just click delete. Now let's go to Edge and double click to select this loop. And just move it down. Okay. And now let's select vertices. And I'll just select the top one. And if I click B, I go into the soft select mode. So if I hold down B and I move the mouse, I can adjust the amount of soft selection that we get. So I only want the top part of the object selected and not the bottom, just so we can squash it here. Not quite. Slightly sharper maybe. Okay. Something like this. And then if I go back and make the soft selection smaller and bring it up again, it's something similar to this, right? Yeah, so B to adjust the radius of your soft selection. So let's turn off soft selection by clicking B again, and let's go into object mode, and it looks pretty good. What would be the best way to get those grooves, I wonder? What I could do, I think I can select, say, let's select all of the edges, and let's just control click and deselect these loops. And this is kind of my way of thinking of just trying to work in the quickest way that I can think of. So control and then double click on these edges to deselect the entire edge loops. So if we deselect all these edge loops, in essence now we have only the vertical edges selected. So now we can actually, let's deselect these center ones as well. And if I go to bevel and increase the fraction to 0.8, not perfect. I think, okay, let's deselect these, but also deselect these. And then go to bevel. And now set this to 0.8. That's a lot more like it. Let's go as far as 0.9. Okay. Now if I select these faces by just clicking one face and then double clicking the one above it while having shift held down, and then just let's do this to all of these. Just like this. And there must be a better way of doing this, but I can't quite think of one. Right now I'm a pretty rough modeler. Okay. So let's deselect these. So we only have these vertical running ones. Okay, so now let's just extrude and push outwards a little bit. Okay, not too much. Maybe a bit less. Okay. Yeah. I think that'll do. We could click to bevel again. Nah, there's no point. Okay, cool. That'll be more than enough for whatever distance we would be seeing this at in the image. So let's just move this down. Actually, there's actually another groove there in the photo, so let's make another cylinder really quickly and scale it up and down in the y-axis, and like so. Okay, something like this. Let's change the subdivision axis to 36. Okay, so let's create an edge loop. Let's put it there, and let's just select this loop of faces, and let's just extrude it slightly outwards. Okay,